Okay, today we're going to be talking about quadratics. This will be an introduction as well as talking about how to solve simple quadratics. So first off, what is a quadratic? A quadratic is anything that has an x squared term. So when we studied linear, we studied things like this. Y equals mx plus b. And notice the power here on x is 1. It's not written there, but it's a power of 1. Quadratics, this is no longer going to be 1, this is going to be 2. So we use y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, and this is called the standard equation for a quadratic. A, b, and c can be any numbers, so you could have something like 3x squared plus 4x plus 5, or you could even be missing some of them and just have something like y equals x squared. But the most important thing is you have to have this x squared. So a can't be 0, but other than 0, it can be any numbers you want. These can both vanish, and it's still quadratics, but you must have this x squared term here. Sometimes you get confused with the graph, so when we get to graphing, we'll talk more about this graph. But the graph of a quadratic either looks like a U shape, or it looks like a rainbow shape, and this is called a parabola. So sometimes we intermix these terms, but strictly speaking, the quadratic refers to the equation, and the shape is called a parabola. But you could say you can graph a quadratic, in which case you're talking about the parabola, or you could say what is the equation for the parabola, in which case you're talking back about the quadratic equation. So know that we use those two terms interchangeably, but quadratic is really referring to the equation, and the shape is really called a parabola. So let's now talk about how to solve these things. So first off, let's talk about a simple case. Let's just say that we have, well, let's talk about what it means to square something first. So let's say we have 3 squared. This means, the square means that I am doing the operation twice. So this says I am doing 3 2 times. So I'm going to multiply 3 2 times, which means 3 times 3. Notice it does not mean 3 times 2. This is 3 2 times. So I have 3 2 times, multiply it, and you get 9. And that can be true for any number. So let's say I do 5 squared. This means I have 5 2 times. So it will be 5 times 5, which is 25. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing here, I'm squaring it. Same thing also happens to the negative number. So if I have negative 2 squared, this is going to be negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4. Because remember, a negative times a negative is a positive. But this brings up an interesting point. If a positive times a positive is going to be positive, and a negative times a negative is going to be positive, then the answer when you square something must be positive, or at least it will be non-negative. So if, for example, 0 squared is simply 0. But other cases than 0, it's going to be positive. So when you square something, you can't get a negative number. As a matter of fact, we have a whole separate branch of mathematics called imaginary numbers. And you will study those in Algebra 2. But just know for right now they're not real, so you can't do them. So we'll come back to this case when we talk about the quadratic formula more. But for right now, you must have positive answers. So you're either going to have 2 positive numbers multiplied together or 2 negative numbers multiplied together, and the answer is going to be positive. So the question is let's actually go back and solve it. So let's say I don't know what that number is, but I can tell you that the answer is going to be 16. So this is saying that my number, when I multiply it by itself, is going to equal 16. So I want you to think for a minute, and you can pause the video, and decide what numbers would make this true. Okay, hopefully you've thought. So the obvious answer is 4, because 4 times 4 is indeed 16, but it's not the only answer. You could have also had said negative 4, because negative 4 times negative 4 is also equal to 16. So we ended up with 2 answers, in both positive 4 and negative 4, and we have a little shortcut. We write plus or minus 4. This means I have 2 answers, both the positive 4 and the negative 4. So feel free to use this symbol. It just means that I have 2 answers, both the positive and the negative. And that's typically going to happen, is when you solve for 1, it's going to be both positive or negative. Not always, but a lot of cases it is true. So notice that this thing has to be positive, because you can't square something and get a negative. So if I gave you something like this, x squared is equal to negative 16, this has no real solutions. And a minute ago we talked about imaginary. Yes, they will be imaginary solutions, so save that for Algebra 2. But right now we can say there are no real solutions, because you can't do that with the real numbers. So when you square something, it simply means you multiply it by itself. But we have a new symbol, at least it might be new to you, and that is this symbol. This does not mean division. This is called the square root symbol. And we say it like this, square root. What square root means is what number times itself gives you the answer of 16. So this is saying what number times itself is 16, and the answer here is 4. And because there's nothing out here, the answer will be positive. Sometimes you write it like this, which is asking you both for the positive and the negative versions of this. So the square root of 16 in this case would be either plus or minus 4. So when you had something like this, you could have both a positive or negative. But when you use the square root symbol, you have to specify if it's going to be positive or negative. And if it's not specified, it's assumed to be positive. So you can now go both directions, to square something and to square root something. So this is how we're going to solve. When you have something simple like this, x squared is equal to 16, we want to just take the square root from it, of both sides. You can do that as long as the square is by itself and you have nothing else here. So as long as the square root is all by itself on one side, you're just going to take the square root of both sides, but you need to remember that we have to do the plus or the minus version of this. So we'll take the plus or minus version. A square and a square root cancel. This is kind of like multiplication and division cancel, addition and subtraction cancel, square and square root cancel. So we're going to undo the square with the square root. We'll do it to both sides. So now we have x, because the square and the square root canceled, and it's going to be plus or minus the square root of 16. Now, you could use a calculator and figure out what the square root of 16 is. If it's not an obvious one, you can leave it as the square root of 16, or you can use a calculator to get a decimal, but you should know that the square root of 16, what number times itself is 16, is going to be 4. So our answer here is going to be plus or minus, oops, excuse me, not the square root, just plus or minus 4. So we have two answers, positive 4 and negative 4. And if you tried it out, you'd find out that's true. 4 times 4 is 16, and negative 4 times negative 4 is also 16. So when you have simple cases, you can just take the square root of both sides, and that will tell you the answer if you can't just look at it and figure it out. But what if I have more interesting cases, like x squared minus 9 is equal to 0? In this case, we have to get the x squared by itself first, and we're going to add 9 to both sides, just like we did when we were doing two-step equations a long time ago in other solving skills. So when you add 9 to both sides, you get x squared is equal to 9, and now it looks just like our other case. So again, you could just figure it out, or we could take the square root of both sides. Remember, it's going to be the plus or negative. So these cancel, and you're left with x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9. And of course, what times itself is going to be 9 is 3. So this is plus or minus 3. Now you could even have more interesting cases and have numbers on both sides. So let's say we had x squared is minus 8 is equal to 1, in which case, again, the goal is to get x squared by itself, so you'd add 8 to both sides, and then you get x squared is equal to 9, and then we'd finish up just like we just did, and you'd end up with plus or minus 3 once again. So as long as you can get x squared by itself, this technique will work. And it even works if you have a number out front here. So let's say I have 2 x squared plus 9 is equal to 0. Let's make that negative. I'm going to make this an 18, just because I want this to work out. So first thing you would do is just like any other two-step equation is we're going to add 18 to both sides. Then I'd have 2x squared is equal to 18. And then I want to get x squared by itself, so we're going to divide both sides by 2, just like we did before. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so you're left with x squared. And over here, 18 divided by 2 is 9. And then you can take the square root of both sides, and you get x is going to be plus or minus 3. So just like other two-step equations, you can do the same thing until you get x squared by itself, and then just take the square root of both sides is how you solve these things. Now we can get a little bit more complicated case, but the technique still works just the same. So let's say I have something like this, x plus 3 squared is equal to 9. Because the square is outside the parentheses, you can still take the square root of both sides. If it was inside the parentheses, you would not be able to do this. But it's outside, so we could still take the square root of both sides because the square is by itself. The square and the square root cancel, so I'm left with x plus 3 on the left-hand side. And over here, we're going to end up with plus or minus 3. Because the square root of 9 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9, or negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. But now I have this plus or minus, and I have to deal with it, and this is really two problems. So here's my two problems. X plus 3 is equal to 3, or x plus 3 is equal to negative 3. And we just have to solve both of these separately. So on this one, we're going to solve by just subtracting 3 from both sides, and x ends up being 0. Or, on this case, we could subtract 3 from both sides, and x ends up being negative 6. So I ended up with two solutions. X could either equal 0 or negative 6. So there's my two solutions, unlike our earlier case where we ended up with two solutions of positive or negative 3. So if you do have a square outside of parentheses, you can still take care of it using this technique. Just remember that you have to solve two solutions, because when you take the square root, you're going to end up with two solutions over here. So that should be all of our simple cases. When we get to the next set of videos, we're going to talk about factoring. Factoring is going to take a while, so make sure you leave lots of time to factoring. But that's it for this video on simple equations.